Last week, Trump signed into law a new tax bill he called the Big Beautiful Bill. But unless you're very rich, this bill isn't that beautiful. In this episode, I want to talk about the scriptural problems with the bill and how America is sacrificing vulnerable populations to its oldest false god, greed. Welcome back to the Righteousness and Justice podcast, where we encourage Christians to biblically and critically think through the issues that affect people every single day. I'm Trey, and today we're talking about something deeply biblical, deeply human, and honestly, deeply urgent. How President Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill, his massive tax legislation, actually hurts the poor and the vulnerable in America. Before we get into it, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and share this podcast with someone who cares about righteousness and justice. Your support, your comments, your conversation really helps us to continue to go. All right, so let's go ahead and jump on in. On July 4th, President Trump signed a large tax bill that will affect more than just how much or less people are taxed, but also access to health care, access to food. It has implications across the country, and it will add at least $3 trillion to the U.S. deficit over the next 10 years. I'm not going to act like I'm a tax law expert or financial guru, but there are some very understandable ways this bill will impact U.S. citizens, specifically the elderly and those who live close, at, or below the poverty line. So first, I want to lay down a scriptural foundation, because as Christians, we don't approach economic policies or any policy like anyone else. We approach them as people who are called to love God and love our neighbor, especially our neighbors who are struggling. Both Old and New Testament scriptures have important words for our consideration. Let's look at our first one. Deuteronomy 15:11 states, "For there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in your land." I've actually heard this scripture quoted to push a theology that inspires people to ignore the poor. As if like, hey, there's going to be poor around you all the time, so don't really pay attention to it. And that just isn't what God is saying here. That's not what the scripture teaches us. If we read the scripture, it shows us that's just the opposite. Let's go to our New Testament scripture. Mark 12:30 and 31 states, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Notice that neither of these commands are passive. They're active. Loving our neighbor means doing something. It means showing care and compassion in practical ways. So any policy, no matter what type of policy it is, must be measured against this call. All right, so let's get practical for a minute. What does Trump's tax bill actually do? Supporters of the bill say it would cut taxes for everyone and create economic growth. But here's the reality behind the headlines. The wealthiest Americans and large corporations receive the biggest permanent, and that's important, permanent tax cuts, with the corporate tax rate falling from 35% to 21%. Middle income and low income Americans got smaller, temporary cuts that phase out over time. It caps deductions for state and local taxes. It repeals the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate. And it makes deep cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, and SNAP. And lastly, the bill is expected to add $3.5 trillion to the federal deficit over the next 10 years. President Trump and the Republicans always campaign on cutting the deficit, but this bill only adds to it. It lays the burden for that deficit on our elders and children who will lose access to health care and food, so the rich continue to get richer. Programs that support the most vulnerable people, Medicaid, nutrition assistance, affordable housing, and other services are being sacrificed at the altar of greed. To pay for the tax cuts for the wealthy, the bill slashes $490 billion from Medicare, which is the health insurance for over 65 million people who are 65 years and older. The bill also cuts $1 trillion from Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP, which affects access to health care and food for over 80 million people, many of whom are children and Americans with disabilities. Repealing the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate drives up premiums for lower income families. Over time, the benefits overwhelmingly tilt toward the wealthiest Americans, making income inequality even worse. If you're someone living paycheck to paycheck, this bill doesn't just mean you might owe a little less in taxes temporarily. It also means you could lose health coverage, face higher costs, or see community programs dry up. From a biblical perspective, this should concern us. God consistently shows a special concern for the poor. In Proverbs 14:31, it says, "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God." This tax bill, in many ways, does the opposite in honoring God's image in the poor. It prioritizes the wealthy while making life harder for those who are already burdened. All right, so then the question is, what should we do about it? First, we should stay informed. It's easy to dismiss tax policy as boring or too complex, but these laws shape our daily lives. Secondly, use your voice. Contact your representatives. Let them know you care about economic justice and support policies that protect the vulnerable. Third, support local ministries that provide food, healthcare, and housing. If the government cuts back, then the church must step up. Fourth, pray. Pray that God would soften the hearts of our policymakers and inspire them to have compassion and to make policies with wisdom. As followers of Jesus Christ, we can't shrug our shoulders and say, well, politics is politics. When policy harms the poor, it becomes a moral issue, a justice issue, a kingdom issue. So the next time someone brings up the big, beautiful bill, remember to ask them, beautiful for whom? Because if it doesn't protect the least of these, it isn't beautiful in the eyes of God. Thank you so much for joining me on the Righteousness and Justice podcast. If this episode challenged you, share it with a friend, leave a review, and please help us keep this conversation going. Until next time, keep loving your neighbor and keep pursuing righteousness and justice.